Hi everyone, thanks for coming along today and welcome to the session Lost. My name is Steph Vizard and I am thrilled to moderate today's session. I think a good rule of life is to always be surrounded by people smarter than yourself, and I think we've definitely achieved that today. So before we begin our conversation, I'd like to introduce all of our panellists. Gail Jones is one of Australia's most celebrated writers. She's the author of 2 short story collections and 10 novels, and her work has been translated into several languages and has received numerous literary awards. Originally from Western Australia, she now lives in Sydney. Her novel, The Name of the Other Sister, is out on the 3rd of June, so it's not out yet. So this is a bit of a treat. So this is the first time that she's talking about her novel. Jane Caro is a Walkley Award-winning columnist, author and novelist and social commentator. She appears on TV, makes lots of speeches and writes regularly in the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Saturday paper. She's written 13 books. Her novel The Mother is a bestseller, and she's also written another bestseller, Lyrebird, which launched in April 2025. Karleah Olson is a Perth-based writer and has recently completed her PhD at Edith Cowan University on Australian coastal Gothic literature. Her debut novel, A Wreck of Seabirds, was shortlisted for the 2023 Fogarty Literary Award and is a work of Gothic fiction inspired by the West Australian coastal landscape. So welcome. So place is at the centre of all of your stories. We've got the fortress-like geography of the inhospitable island in A Wreck of Seagulls. We've got the rainforest hiding lots of secrets in Lyrebird, and also the Australian outback with its red dirt around Broken Hill in The Name of the Sister. All of these settings are integral to the stories themselves. Could you tell us about your books and also when you got your first pinprick of an idea for the place that your story is set? Maybe we'll start with you, Gail.
Is this on? Thank you for being here. It's lovely to be sharing the stage with Steph, Karleah and Jane. My novel actually has 2 settings. The first half of the novel is in Sydney, the second half is in the area around Broken Hill, and especially a little town called Silverton. Some of you may know these places. This is in part because I didn't want a desert in my book. This is my first attempt, my 11th book and my first attempt at crime, although my publisher points out I've got lots of crimes in my other books. But my first attempt at a kind of procedural crime, and I wanted to splice together what I usually do, which is character-driven interior sort of texts with lots of layers, with the drive of a crime. But I really didn't want a desert because I wanted to critique or at least question the tropes of the crime novel. And there's lots of deserts in contemporary Australian crime. But there were a couple of things that attracted me nevertheless to these areas. One is that my parents grew up in Kalgoorlie and that I spent part of my childhood there. And my grandfather was a miner. My father went into the mines at 14. It sounds very Dickensian, but this was the case. And I remember going there as a child and being very struck, not only by that kind of saturation of light and the space and the kind of amplitude of the place, but the idea that beneath my feet, in the dark, under the ground, were workers coughing, like my grandfather always coughed. And that idea that there's a hidden and a visible and a hidden was very important to me as a child, and it's become part of my image repertoire, so it tends to be in each novel that I write some axis of the hidden and the revealed. So that was one thing that drew me to it. I guess another was the spectacular nature of this landscape. So if you know it, my day job has been for many years as a teacher, and for about 4 years I taught cinema. And there was a moment in Australian cinema where there was always an establishing shot from the air of the desert. This is before drones, and what you saw was a sense of radical scale and an aestheticizing of place and a sense of the enigma of this place. It was about the same time in Australian cinema, late 80s, early 90s, when dot paintings were being appreciated for the first time too. So it was also that kind of awareness as an adult that there's another set of meanings here, some of which are to do with beauty. And I guess very briefly, since I am a bit unpracticed thinking and explaining my book, but my protagonist is a journalist who wants to be a poet, and she's a bit of a mess, I think. So the first half of the novel in Sydney is about a marriage breakup, and the second half is about the physical challenge of being in those kinds of spaces. So it sort of suited me for her to follow a crime to this kind of place, full of these kinds of contradictions.
Jane, going down the line.
Thank you very much. I identified with a lot of what you were just saying, because Lyrebird is my first police procedural crime novel as well. The mother was called a crime novel, but I didn't actually think of it that way when I was writing it. But you know, nothing encourages you like success. So when the mother did really well, I thought, okay, if you want crime, crime is what I will give you. And the way I didn't come at this thinking I want to write about this particular place. Basically what happened was I was struggling with another novel that wasn't proceeding the way that I wanted it to, and I was spending a lot of time in my own head, you know, trying to solve the puzzle of why I couldn't get it to work. And my husband and I are very fortunate. We have a property on the edge of the Barrington Tops National Park up at the Upper Allen, and we often walk in the park because why wouldn't you? It's fabulous. And so we were walking one morning, and we weren't chatting. I don't know what Ralph was thinking about, but I was struggling with this novel in my head as we were walking along. And suddenly Ralph put his hand up and kind of stopped me. And ahead of us, the reason he did that was ahead of us was a lyrebird. It had just come out of the undergrowth and was walking in front of us, about 10 or 15 feet in front of us. And so we were very quietly following this bird. And whenever you get into that kind of situation with a wild creature, there's a real sense of the honour it is to get to see such wonderful creatures up close and them not know you're there. And so we were just walking along behind it. And I suppose because I've been struggling with this other novel, I started to think about lyrebirds, and I started to think about what amazing creatures they were and their fabulous mating dance, but then I started to think about their extraordinary ability to mimic. And the thought came to me, what if a lyrebird witnessed a murder? So, I don't know, thank you, God of the lyrebirds. That idea really excited me, and it excited me for a couple of reasons. Of course, one was that it was a cute and I thought original hook for a crime novel, and there are a lot of crime novels, so that's a bit of a challenge, trying to work out how to do it, you know, with some originality. But it was more than that. I started to realise as I thought about it that it was a really substantial metaphor for what we're doing as a species, humanity as a species, that in a way we're at a point where nature bears witness to the crimes of humanity and is keeping the score and showing us all the time, what havoc, what crimes we are committing. Now, the book is about a very human-to-human crime, but it is also about the crimes being perpetrated on the natural world every day. And I got excited because I thought this is something I really would like to write about. And so the place was decided for me because it's a lyrebird. Lyrebirds live in rainforests. It has to be in a rainforest. And there happened to be one on my doorstep. So I thought, I'll use that one. And none of the places in the book are made up. They all exist, and I use their real names. The last book, The Mother, a lot of it was in Dungog, which is the nearest town to where we are. It's still 55 minutes drive away, but it's the nearest town. And I had to spend quite a lot of time after that book was published apologising profusely to the Dungog vet. Any of you who have read the book will know why. But in a weird way, although I apologise to him, I make no apologies for that. I actually find I really enjoy writing about real places. The people are all products of my imagination. They're not based on anyone. But the place, I love that reality of the place and being able to describe it. And much to my relief, the neighbours absolutely love that I set these murder mysteries, you know, in the house next door to them. They think it's awesome.
Karleah. Yes, hello. So the place was also really important for me writing Rec. I wrote this novel as part of my PhD thesis, and when I went into it and started research, I had no idea of the novel I was going to write. So from a narrative perspective, I had nothing. The only thing I did have was the setting. So I really started with the landscape. It's set in a fictionalised version of a lot of areas near where I live and grew up in Perth, in the northern suburbs. I fictionalised it to make it feel more isolated, like a small town, because I live not too far from Perth. But all the places are inspired by landscapes that I see every day of my life, and I really love the coastal landscape. I really liked the idea of taking this beautiful place that we see as quite idyllic, like today it's beautiful, the coast, and like Jane was saying, the landscape bears witness, I think, nature bears witness, and I wanted to draw on that idea of really dark things happening in beautiful places. Our country does have a pretty dark history, and the Gothic is all about the re-emergence of the past into the present and asserting itself in that landscape. So the landscape was really, really important to me from the beginning.
Amazing. Now, the theme of today's session is lost, which is so apt because in all of your stories there are women who have become lost in society. So undocumented migrants, people with disabilities, young women travelling. But also your narrators are very lost, often in grief and in loneliness. Was this a theme that you started with, or did it emerge? And what drew you to these characters that were very lost in the past often? Should we go down the line again, Gail?
I think life is composed of loss. There seems to be an idea that writing comes from plenitude. You have heaps to say and you just externalize it. But I think that we have all lost many things. We've all lost a childhood. We've all lost friends and lovers and, people to death. Grief is the main form of our loss, the main expressive form. For me, it's a fairly constant theme. It's in a lot of my books. And I suppose because I spent so long being a teacher, my mind goes immediately to a poem. There's an Elizabeth Bishop poem called One Art. And the one art is the art of losing things. So it's a villanelle. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem so intent on being lost that their loss is no disaster. And it goes on like that, this sort of jaunty poem about losing things and coming to terms with it. But because of the poetic form, it's always rhyming disaster and master. And that part of the role that we have in life is to learn how to master the losses. and how to manage the disasters. So it is something that I think perhaps for me is a philosophical question about where art comes from, where meaning comes from, the role of art in sort of dealing with loss, perhaps covering loss, perhaps compensating or offering solace. So it's not a surprise to me that I keep writing about this, but my novel is about missing. I mean, my novel opens with a woman found, not lost. However, its wider remit, as it were, is with missing persons, which is unresolved grief. It's the anguish of never having an answer to the huge grief that people bear who are bearing witness to the lack of closure. I hate that word, but there's a kind of particular agony, I think, a community out there, and there are a lot of them. I've done a little bit of research on this. A lot of people who have no answer to who has gone lost. So for me, it was that philosophical position, as it were, about the meaning of life, but it was also this emotional territory of how do we deal with absent presence, the sense that someone has become a kind of ghost haunting us, who is not fully gone but not present, and that sort of the drama of expression and repression that involves is something that concerns me. That's a rather vague answer, I'm sorry, but that's how I think about loss and lost people as the site of grief, as the kind of principal site of grief.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is that all your stories do so brilliantly, is balance that tension between a narrative drive to know a truth versus this sense of unresolved grief, in that loss involves some tension with the unresolved. So no, beautifully put, Jane.
Yes, I think actually that my protagonists, Megan and Jessica, Megan is the detective, Jessica the ornithology student who first films the lyrebird mimicking the desperate, dying woman. But they're not lost. They have lost. They have losses. But actually they're not lost. And that's one of the reasons that they are able, in a way, to go out and find. Because they are women, well, particularly Megan, I think. Megan, we meet her first as a wet behind the ears new detective. She's the only person who takes Jessica's claim. You know, she comes running down having filmed this bird mimicking, having thought that she was about to bear witness to a real murder, and then realising that it was the lyrebird and being relieved, and then suddenly realising, hang on, lyrebirds don't make up what they perform, they mimic. Therefore, this murder must have happened, and it must have happened because lyrebirds are territorial here. So she takes her evidence to the police, who, and this is 20 years before now, and who react as perhaps you might imagine they would when a young woman walks in and says, I'm here to report a murder, tell me about it, what do you mean? And she says, oh, it's all on here, and lobs the camera on the counter, and the cop says, what, you filmed a murder? And she goes, no, I filmed a lyrebird mimicking a murder. You might know how that might go down. And so there's only one detective who takes her seriously, and that's Megan, who's just begun. She's 40, Jessica's in her 20s, and she's come to it late because she's been bringing up kids and doing all those things that women do that delay you getting to where you want to go. And she takes Jessica seriously and tries to investigate, but they can't find a body, and they can't even find a missing person. They find nothing to back up this evidence, and so it goes cold for 20 years. And then a body's found. And Megan has retired. She's 60 and her husband has been dying, and she's really retired both to look after him as he is dying and then to deal with her grief and loss. But by the time we see her again, she has actually, she's not over her grief. I don't think grief's something you get over, but she's come to a place where she has energy again and she wants to move out. And so getting asked to, they turn up and they say to her, we reckon this is your cold case. We found a body just where that student said it would be. We want you, you're the only person who's done any investigating. Can you come back and carry on with the case? And she does. And by this point in her life, I think Megan has taken possession of herself, her work, her achievements and her power. She is actually a woman who has found herself. And there are lots of women in the book who are very, very lost. Many who've been sexually trafficked, and horribly, the results of that have been horrible for some of them. But it's also about women who have found themselves, including Coco, who's a trans character who has found herself literally as herself. And so I really like all my female characters, all my characters really, to have some sort of agency, to not be the sad, anonymous victim. Even the body that is found, we hear about her life, we hear about who she was and the incredible effect that she had on the people around her, and also her legacy. Because for me, we need to remember that people contain multitudes, and no one is a victim and no one is a survivor. We're all of those.
Karleah?
Yeah, so Rec is very focused on the idea of loss. It's about two young people, Ren and Bryony, who meet on the coast of their small town, and they form a connection and get to know each other sort of over their different experiences of loss. So Bryony has a younger sister who has been a missing person for 2 years. So she's sort of in limbo, waiting in this town, not moving on with her life, sort of just waiting for her sister to come back or waiting for answers. And then Ren, who she meets, has come back to this town where he lost his little brother a decade before to drowning. And he's come back to care for his father, who is dying and suffering from Alzheimer's. So his father is sort of fading away in front of him and is not the person he remembers. So there's a lot of different forms of loss, because you have a missing person who is sort of a ghost in this narrative, because there aren't any answers at the stage Bryony's at. And, Sam, the little brother, is a ghost to Ren, and then he's also living in this house with his father, who is there and not there. So that idea of being haunted by this sort of absent presence is there the whole way through.
The girls that are literally lost.
Yeah, and the girls are lost on the island as well. We've got a secondary storyline which does tell you a little bit of what happened to Sarah, the missing sister, and her friend Aria, and they find themselves trapped on this island. So I went into writing this focused a lot on ideas of isolation and entrapment, so in physical ways but also in emotional ways, through loss and grief and all of those things.
And I think that in all your books there is a missing woman of some sort, and that means that the stakes are incredibly high, and it sort of really plays on that, I think, deeply human fear of being lost, of being unfindable. And so they're, in all cases, page turners, because you want that resolution. And so I'm really interested to know what the process was of writing these stories. If you could talk to the writing process.
Well, my novel begins with a woman being found. So I did know that I didn't want to begin with a dead body, a dead woman's body. I wanted to think through those structures of crime and how fixed they've become And I haven't read my colleagues' works yet, but I'm really looking forward to them because it sounds as though there are a lot of resonances between us, not least in our wish to recover the story of the space of the dead woman or the missing person, to actually endow that with affective power and with meaning, to replace that cipher of the dead woman with a space of meaning. So my interest, I suppose, just lost my train of thought. What was the question?
What was the process of writing this?
The process of writing. So I began with wishing, I suppose, to contest the trope of beginning with the dead body by beginning with a woman who appears at night. I hope that's not a sign. At night on the road outside of Broken Hill, but she cannot speak, and I know that is a well-worn trope, but she cannot tell her own story. But she's a found woman, and the enigma for my text is who is this woman and what happened to her and where did the crime take place? And that's why she is sort of tracked to Broken Hill. And it's not that I have my protagonist is actually a journalist who wants to be a poet, and her best friend is the detective. Her best friend is a childhood friend and a woman, so there are lots of forms of sisterhood that I'm rehearsing in my book. But I wanted there to be, as it were, this kind of poetic level, to have a character who is densely human and complicated and struggling with being a journalist who wants to be a poet. So there's poetry and there's jazz music and there's cinema and all these kinds of things at work in my book. But it wasn't, I hope it's not programmatic, and it doesn't sound as though any of us have written programmatic books, that the task perhaps for those of us entering the genre, especially with a feminist politics, is actually to rework it, to give back solidarity, agency, and density to those sort of, I suppose, cliches of crime, really. And so when I began the novel, the process was that I was intending to write an urban novel set in Sydney. I took a break. I went to Broken Hill and hung around for a while in a very dodgy motel. I was by myself, and I hired a very big four-wheel drive, so I did a bit of bush bashing as well, and just sort of thought about this space. And for me, the surprise was to discover the Indigenous story of Broken Hill, that there is when you go there, it's all about mineral wealth and the kind of heroism of wealth, which I found a bit tragic. It's about BHP, of course, but there's another foundation story. The Wilyakali people have a songline that goes all the way from South Australia to Western New South Wales to Queensland, about a bird, actually. This is something interest we share, about a bird that is dying, and it drops its feather. It's the bronze-winged pigeon, which has silver, copper, and gold in its wings, and it makes the mineral deposits possible. It's a songline almost as long as the Seven Sisters. It's a very beautiful story. So I wanted to have a space for other kinds of meaning, for the poetic, for the beautiful, and not have it sort of glumly tragic, to feel that women are always subject to violence, and that this that working that through has a programmatic or resigned aspect to it. So I'm not a crime novelist. It is my first attempt, and I wanted to see what might be possible. I don't know if that...
Fascinating. I was about to say the panel really could have been called Birds, really, given the titles and themes that flow through your books. Jamin, how was your process?
I don't know. I don't really think it through. I'm very impressed by people, often crime writers in fact, who do a lot of preparation and, they've got it all worked out before they put their finger to keyboard. They've got cards with everything, all the events and, the characters. I just lost in admiration for that, but I couldn't imagine doing it. And I always start off with an idea at the beginning, usually a vague idea of how it's going to end up. And I really don't have very much of a clue how I'm going to get from there to there. Now, this makes me, of course, a pantser, fly by the seat of, and much to the despair of my editors. But what I find by following that process is that I go on this journey, and so it's always solving the puzzle of the book. So I had the opening scene and the idea and the fact that this body had lain unnoticed for 20 years and that the person who had been that body was not missing, no one had even noticed that she had gone. And so the first question I had to ask myself was, how does that happen? And the answer that came to me was women who are trafficked. Because if you're trafficked, you by definition have no identity, you make no mark. You don't come up on any database or any DNA or anything like that. And so that led me immediately to one of the major things in the book. And I had to go and do some research because this may surprise you, but I don't actually know anything about human and sex trafficking. So I had to go and find out. And that was fascinating and disturbing. It's the sort of thing a lot of Australians think doesn't happen here. Actually, as someone told me at an event, organised crime in Australia makes more money out of human and sexual trafficking than they do out of drug dealing. So my awareness was changed, and I think that's one of the things I'm starting to do with my fiction, or actually started to do with my activism. I've moved a lot of my activism into writing fiction because it's actually a really good place to explore in a different way and with a different audience. The thing that in an article might be more predictable. So that was part. My process is to let my characters and the sort of logic of the book lead me forward. This means I go down some stupid dead ends and my editor tears their hair out and says, well, that's rubbish, get rid of that. But that's all right, I don't mind that. I'm not setting out to write the perfect book or be the perfect writer. I'm just trying to tell the tale that has gripped me as truthfully as I can. And it's fiction, so why would I be talking about truth? But I think the thing about fiction is it's an emotional truth that you're looking for. And in a way that's, to me at the moment, I mean, I still love writing non-fiction and articles. I'm not comparing the two and saying one's better than the other. But for me at the moment, I love this idea of how you can get to emotional truth almost better in a fiction than you can in a non-fiction. Because a non-fiction is necessarily more intellectual than fiction, and also it's a true story. It has real truth and not your truth, unless you're writing a memoir, in which case, yes, you can. But otherwise, because I've made these people up, I can get into their skin and their emotional responses, and as much as I want, without feeling I'm trespassing on something I wouldn't really know about. So that gives you a kind of freedom to explore and to discover. And my characters pop up in front. They suddenly appear on the page with their name, which is why the Dungog vet is still so cross with me. And I find it very hard to change their name because they are to me like real people. They're not real people, they're not based on real people. So my process is one of discovery, and I'm discovering. And what that means is by the end of it's not until the end of the book or when I'm doing lots of sessions like this that I start to understand what my book is about. Because I'm doing it as the spirit moves me, I guess. I know, wacky, weird. That's my process. if you can give it that highfalutin name, and I'm not sure you can.
Can I just ask, do those characters come fully formed to you in the first draft, or is that once you've been living with them
First
for a while?
draft. It's first draft. The characters pop up in the first draft. I'm trying to think if I've added any characters ever in a later draft. I don't think I have.
Wow.
So they just come as I go through the... Because quite often when you just write... And I think a lot of people get really blocked when they want to write because they're trying to write the perfect sentence. I really couldn't give a shit about the perfect sentence. And I want it to be a grammatically correct sentence, That's fine. But does it move the... Does it tell us things we need to know? And I find that with the characters popping up like that and then they come with their voice too, so they become easier to write with their own kind of idiosyncratic way of just getting on in the world. And I find that you write a sentence and then you think, oh, well, the next sentence just has to be, and then you write the next sentence. And that's kind of, if you let, for me, if I let that happen, I have a better result. Now, it means it goes through quite a lot of drafts.
Thanks. Karleah, what's your process?
So this is my debut novel, so going into it I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really have a process, but I did write it, like I said, as part of my PhD. So it was quite academic, obviously. The way a PhD works when you're doing something creative like this is you spend about 6 months of initial research into a field, and then you present that to a room full of people, and it's really intimidating, and you sort of say, this is what I found and this is what I want to do with this creative work. So I spent an initial 6 months researching a few different things. So I looked at Australian gothic fiction, contemporary coastal fiction, so I looked at a lot of like Tim Winton and Robert Drew. I looked at a lot of mythology surrounding the coast and the ocean. So I looked at a lot of stuff like sirens and mermaids and selkies. This book didn't end up having a fantasy element, but there's a lot of undercurrents of the ideas that I found. I really liked the idea of lure, and that something can draw you in and keep you there. So I tried to sort of put that in the book in terms of the place. And have this location sort of holding these characters there. So my process started with kind of a whole bunch of ideas and like almost like an energy. And then I had to sit down and actually write the novel, which for a while in that research stage was quite intimidating because I was doing academic research and not like planning a creative work. So I was like, what if it doesn't come to me and I have no idea what to write? But what ended up being the opening scene in the book did kind of pop into my head almost fully formed. I had this character, Bryony, running along the coastal track, and she comes across a young man standing in the water, visibly in a bit of emotional turmoil. And she's sort of in two minds whether she should approach this guy or not. And I was a bit like Bryony, and I had to know his story, and I had to know what put him there and what was going on in his head. So that's where it started. And it did sort of feel just like it unravelled from there. Obviously, there were times when I did some big edits and took things out. There are 3 narrative strands in this story. So I started with Ren and Bryony, and their story I sort of followed the whole way through. And then we have Sarah and Arya's story on the island, which is set 2 years prior, and young Ren and his brother Sam a decade prior. So those timelines came later on, but Ren and Bryony was there from the beginning. Yeah.
Wow. It's so interesting sort of seeing how everyone has their different process, but that what unites you all is there was some kind of almost magic to it that drew you to the stories. So in The Name of the Sister, the narrator thinks in the last week or two the story had gained traction abroad. So that's the story of someone being found. The Oz horror genre, always popular, had been invoked. I think that's really interesting, particularly when what you were saying about cinema studies, and you've got this sort of sort of classic shot that everyone knows of sort of the overview of the landscape. So I'm interested in what you think it is that, on an international stage too, captures the imagination about Australian landscapes, and what is it about stories in the genres that you've written that makes them so unique to Australia?
Right. Well, first I'd like to confirm what Jane said. It's always encouraging because so much of what writers say about their work is in retrospect. That there's a notion abroad that writers know what they're doing, and we really do not. But there is, and again, Karleah has also confirmed this, and it's very reassuring for me to be in good company. That there's some kind of pull of an image. There's something from which one unfolds a narrative, or you use the word revelment, unravelment. And I've done a lot of, I'm a sort of academic, but I have mentored a lot of writers now, and often it's about finding that thing that can be a different kind of engine to the story that isn't plot. And I have met a lot of crime writers. One of the best known, whose name I will not mention here, a bloke, spends a year and a half plotting his text before he begins. And I would find that maddening, and I suspect Jane and Karleah might too. And it's one of the problems with the academic procedure of writing. But having something that has this mysterious capacity to move and set up an enigma. And in this novel, in my novel, I have two of them. The opening is of an image on telly of a man sitting beside a crumpled building within which his family are entombed. And we've all seen a lot of those images recently. The second item on the television news is of a single woman, this mute woman who's been discovered on the road in the darkness. I just put those two side by side because it's exactly that kind of that kind of jarring leap that we make every time we watch the news. It's about scale. How do we honour both world historical violence and think it through and live with that scale? And how do we also invest in and retain the integrity of the individual who's been hurt? So I'm sorry to go back to the earlier question, but I was very struck that I'm also a pantser, not a planner. And I remember when I first heard that distinction thinking, yes, it is partly about intuition and actually trusting intuition and not feeling you have to say in 1939 in the town of something, this is what happened, but to start with an inciting notion or an image or an idea. So thank you. And you asked me about
Australia.
Why
it captures the imagination.
Yeah. So what Karleah has said about the Gothic interests me a great deal. So the Gothic is a model of writing that is about unrepressing, finding. So that in terms of the history of the novel, you have Jane Austen writing the early 1800s. Writing these realist novels about people being well-behaved, rational, and getting married. But she also wrote a novel in 1803, her parody of the Gothic novel, because she was alarmed. She wrote 5 novels, I think 5 or 6, at these other novels which were about violence, repression, dreams, nightmares, and that's the territory of the Gothic. Now, it fascinates me that this has become a term for Australian crime, and I think it's a white fella thing. I really think that for settler Australians, going into wild spaces feels dangerous and risky and like the return of the repressed. But I think for Indigenous people, these are sacred spaces. They do not feel that apprehension, that sense of imminent destruction, of a kind of murderous power to things. And I loved that Jane's description of the lyrebird, who is a kind of witness, this idea that the world is witnessing us, and that there's a whole other narrative and a whole other mystery about place that Australia as a settler colony who has usurped these other meanings, or, Broken Hill before it was excavated, before it became a symbol of wealth for the nation. What might it have meant, and might there be a joy, an ecstasy even, in visiting those wild spaces? So,
Jane?
I think it is very much what Gail was just saying, because certainly in the Western world, particularly in Europe, there's little, if any, wilderness left. They have become so civilised. And yet we are privileged, though we appear to be rapidly destroying that privilege, to live in a place where there is a lot of wilderness, a lot of places that appear certainly untouched by Western hands, unmoulded, if you like, in the way that Westerners change and seem compelled to change the landscape. So I think that there's a yearning for it, perhaps, in very civilised places, a yearning for this dangerous, dark, almost primeval wilderness. So that makes, it attractive and exotic in those senses as well. But I also think, and this was one of the ideas that really caught me with the Lyrebird thought, that what we're talking about when we look at the way capitalist society is designed to dominate and to change and to extract and to use and to penetrate and to destroy, really, to kind of suck dry whatever is seen as of value out of wilderness, out of vulnerability, out of what they often term virgin land. And what I saw in the comparison as I was writing and started to understand a bit more when I'd finished was that urge to dominate and destroy the natural world is the same urge as the one that wants to dominate and destroy vulnerable people as well, to exploit and to destroy them. And that there's also, therefore, a fascination with, it's Freudian, isn't it? The creative and the destructive, the life and the death, and the two things are always kind of in constant tension with one another. And maybe the Australian landscape and the Australian story, in that we still have observable wilderness left, we're kind of living out Europe's past right now. And so, of course, they're interested.
Karleah?
Yeah, I think Australian fiction to other people and also to Australians, one of the biggest draws is the landscape and the way that Australian writers write landscape. It's one of my favourite things about Australian fiction. Something I find really interesting that's quite prevalent in Australian Gothic is this idea of vastness in the landscape, this idea of space, and it has this sort of contradiction of there being so much of it that it becomes confining. And I think that does call back to settler history, of course, because settlers came here to this sort of wide open landscape and all these really, really vast spaces, but it was a prison sentence, and it was something confining. And I found it really interesting to turn the Australian Gothic genre to a coastal setting, because I think looking out at the ocean can feel a bit like that. There is so much of it, but you can't tame it and you can't control it. And yeah, I think that's really interesting. So the landscape, I think, to me is the most interesting thing about Australian fiction.
Yeah, I think we've got a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any. I think we've got one here.
I heard David Nichols speak last week. While you've been talking, you've been absolutely surrounded by birds. None of you can see it, but all of us can. And he said at the end of his novel that he had 4 different endings. And I'm wondering if that's normal. And you've all talked about the beginnings, but not about the endings. Is that normal to have so many possibilities when you get towards the end? And how do you settle on the final end?
I'm much less interested in endings than in the process of getting there and the kind of layerings of, taking a reader through a certain kind of experience of emotional solidarity, inviting them into a space. But I'm very interested in open-ended endings, and this is a problem for crime fiction because this part of the satisfaction is having a solution or an answer. So I suppose I'm trying to have it both ways, and I imagine that's not a very... That's probably not a very useful answer to give you. But I think unless you plan ahead, you don't know the ending, and that is also part of the intuitive process. And in my experience, readers are quite comfortable if the text is about the question, not the answer. What questions does this human scenario dramatized raise for me? And yeah, the community of the question is something that interests me a great deal, rather than the community of answers.
I've never actually been in doubt about the final scene. What the ending is exactly, I'm not sure. The mother does not end where a crime novel should end. And a lot of people say to me, thank you for going on about what happened after. Because crime novels, part of it is that you finish once the puzzle is solved. And that's not what I did. And that's been an interesting response from readers. And with Lyrebird, I knew I wanted some sort of symbol of renewal and hope. But I'm not going to tell you anything about the ending apart from that. You may have read it, madam, and I'm extremely pleased that you have, and thank you for your excellent taste. But I'm hoping some haven't and would like to buy a book after this, so if you want to find out what ending I landed on, you're going to have to buy the book.
So I knew from the beginning how I wanted Rec to end. I think it's probably not exactly how readers want it to end. But there is a fair bit of ambiguity, but that is very fitting with the Gothic genre. You do get some answers, and you don't get others. But if you think of a lot of classic Australian Gothic, Picnic at Hanging Rock is a really good one. And those girls vanish into that landscape and you never know what happened to them. So ambiguous endings are a really big part of the Gothic genre. So I kind of knew that I wanted, obviously I had a lot of questions coming up, and I knew that I wanted there to be some stuff tied up and some stuff not, just to fit with the genre.
Can I just say something about birds? Yeah. Because Jane has a lyrebird on her cover. I have an ibis on my cover. And the ibis in Sydney, you all know the bin chickens and how utterly disparaged and despised they are because they're grubby and they get in the way. But the ibis is sacred, of course, to Indigenous people in Australia, and it's sacred in Egypt. And my detective has a past as a childhood where she's obsessed with the ibis and the god Thoth. This is what the ibis represents, a particular god who is the god of writing. So I just thought I'd throw that in there because nobody's, you're the first people who've seen this book. It's not even in bookshops yet. But I've already had people say, what is this thing on the cover? This doesn't look like any kind of crime book. So, and bird life. Bird life is important in Australia. We get to see so much of it, and it's so exalting to see it.
We still have some.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there's one in the audience. Yes.
Hi. I was interested in what particularly Gail had to say about it being Australia being a sort of settler colony, and therefore the relationship that the colonising people have with the landscape is quite different from the relationship that the Indigenous people might have had. Now, all of you are writing about Australian landscape within this sort of context. And I haven't read, obviously, Gail's latest book. Do you think it's problematic to write a book about that and then also or is it difficult to also embrace the Indigenous view of the landscape when you're writing from the perspective, really, of the coloniser?
That's such a good question and such an important one. And my way of dealing with this is not to take up an Indigenous point of view. So I do have an Indigenous character who tells the story of the creator bird of Broken Hill, without sort of editorialising commentary from anyone. They're just people sitting, listening at a campfire. This woman saying, "Let me tell you the story of this place." And it took many months to get permission from the custodians of this story to publish. So I did tell the publisher that I wouldn't publish this book. I would withdraw it unless I got permission. And it had been withdrawn. It was written a year ago, and then suddenly I got permission. And that I'm very glad I was patient. I would not have felt able to proceed. And it's a tiny section of my book. It's like less than a page. But I wanted to, having heard this story, which is a story that is like there's been this ethno-anthropological work with Indigenous people, and they can see where all the silver and copper and gold deposits are, and it's the track of the bird. That's an astonishing degree of sophisticated, intelligent, topographical knowledge that extends right across Australia. So I having heard that story or read about it in a land rights claim, I couldn't disavow it. But I thought, I can't just take it. And I did a lot of work finding out who are the custodians, what are their names, what is their story, what can I use and not use, just for a tiny little section of the novel. But I hope that it resonates. I hope it says, yes, there are other meanings. So, but that's a great question, and it vexes us. Any writer, any white fella writer in Australia, it ought to vex us.
It's always a challenge to write about characters who have lived experiences that are very different from your own, and also perspectives different from your own. But I think it would be a much poorer literature if we therefore allowed that fear to make us take the easy road. I have an Indigenous character in the book. He's a very down-to-earth kind of guy, but he gives just little bits of an Indigenous perspective. And I think, because he's a police officer, it's not his role, like he's part of the investigating team. But I also have the trafficked women are from lots of different places, including parts of Southeast Asia, and it was really important to me to find people who not had themselves lived experience. I was lucky enough to find 2 Filipino social workers who worked with a charity that worked with the abandoned children of Western sex tourists in that country. And what they're doing in that charity, I put the link in the end of the book so you can donate if you like, is they are trying to, via the DNA of those children, trace those fathers and hold them to account financially for the support of their children, which is an extremely wonderful thing to see someone doing. But their reading of the book, the draft, from a purely selfish novelist's point of view, stopped me making some egregious white women mistakes. And I think it is absolutely incumbent on novelists who want to write a broad cast of characters and experiences to do their research and to check, as you did, as I've done, the lived experience of the people that you're writing about, and make sure that you have treated those characters with respect and sensitivity and not made egregious errors. And that was a really learning experience for me. So that was a privilege, really, to be able to do that work. So I can't write other than who I am and what I know. But I think that one of the things you can do is know where that knowledge stops and another knowledge starts.
There aren't any Indigenous characters in my novel, but a big part of Australian Gothic fiction is that acknowledgement that places have history and that places and the landscape can hold trauma. So I think that acknowledgement that there is an understory to any narrative that you put over the top of it is there, and that it's always existing. And I really like the idea of these stories and narratives sort of being layered and unfolding at the same time. So I think that's really important if you're writing anything landscape-based.
Thank you. I think we've hit time. Thank you so much, Gail, Jane and Karleah. They're fantastic books.